The thing I like to focus on now is forces. And so thinking back to our little stir fry analogy, this is kind of like adding in all the little extra bits of spices and sauces that'll make this interesting. So what I'm going to do is I can add some pop forces under this pops menu. And again, these all deal with forces that act on particles. And that's a good way of affecting the behavior. But we also have these forces right here that affect the entire scene. And they're a little bit different than the pop sources that you saw earlier. So I'm going to take, let's say, a wind force right there. And whenever you use these forces, it's common convention to actually place these forces underneath the solver like that. The solver is still going to respect the fact that there is a wind force. And as a matter of fact, another reason why I use the stir fry analogy is that everything in DOPS kind of acts like a stir fry. It's all just kind of gathered in one place and being tossed around, right? It's not necessarily a top to bottom approach like you might be used to as SOPs. Data can oftentimes flow upward in the chain or flow downward or across, and it's all just kind of mixed in there, just like a stir fry would be if it was just mixed inside of a pan. So in this case, we have our wind force, and it's below the solver. And the reason why we put it below is so that we can basically easily see that this is affecting the entire scene. If we had multiple solvers and we wanted one wind across all of them, this would be the way to do that. And with this wind, if I go ahead and press play, it's going to freak out. And that's because of this scale force. Right now it's set to 100, which is way too much. If I set this to, let's say, 1, and I press play, we are now left with something that is much better. And the cool thing about this wind is that it actually gives us this neat little effect right here. It's kind of an interesting shape that this wind makes. Also, by the way, since we are here, I don't know if I've mentioned yet this whole little clock icon at the bottom. By default, this whole time, you might have been having this whole thing freak out on you like that. And that's because it's not playing 24 frames per second. This clock here will allow you to do that. And also, if you'd like to change your time range to be something besides 240, which is the maximum end frame, you can change that number right here, again at the bottom right. So I'm at 72 right now. Your scene is probably all the way out to 240. And, when we're just trying things out, sometimes you want to decrease that number. Anyway, hopefully that hasn't tripped you up too much yet. We're here, we have our forces, we have our wind. All right, so what else can we do? Well, let's add some more pop forces. And again, we can connect that here with our merge. And actually, before we start doing that, let's adjust our wind. I don't want this going in the Z direction. I want this going in the Y direction. So let's go 1 in Y, 0 in Z. And now we just have some particles that are flowing upwards, just like that. And it looks pretty cool. All right, we have this pop force. And again, with this pop force, we can add additional noise. So I'm going to take this amplitude here and set it to 1 and see what that does for us. It gives us a little bit of additional breakup, which I like. I think the next thing that we ought to talk about now is the birth tab in our pop source node. So I'm going to stop this for a minute. Let's go to our pop source and see what we have. First of all, we have this impulse activation and this constant activation. And what are the differences between these two? Both of these sort of settings can be responsible for spawning particles, but they actually spawn it in different ways. Right now, I have a constant birth rate of 50,000 particles. And what that's saying is that for every second, it's going to create 50,000 particles. We are at 24 frames per second. So on frame 24, if I go to my geometry spreadsheet, I should have geometry about 50,000 particles that have been made. So that is what that is referring to. If I turn that off and I go to the impulse count now, and let's say I go with 50,000 and the impulse. What the impulse is saying is that every single time our pop solver calculates something, it needs to create 50,000 particles. So we're at frame 1 right now. What we see in the viewport is the results of what the pop solver has thought about. So if you go to our geometry spreadsheet, we have 50,000 particles. On frame 2, this pop solver has cooked again, meaning that it's thought through everything again, and we're at 10,000. And now we're at about 15, and we're at about 20, and so on and so forth. So that's what that impulse activation and impulse count is referring to. When it comes to the constant activation, as well as the impulse activation, a good way of thinking about these is kind of like a light switch. So let's say that I want these particles to spawn for a period of time, and then I want them to stop spawning. Well, I can animate that either with the constant birth rate right here, or more conveniently with this activation. So we haven't talked about animation, but get ready, because here we go. This constant activation, let's say we want to leave this on, right? Hold down Alt and click the lettering. This will create a keyframe for that value, and you'll see it marked down here by this little green notch at frame 1. And let's say that on frame 24, I want it to stop spawning particles. I can now say 0, hold down Alt, click the letters, and this now created a keyframe on frame 24. So if I press play now, we have it, and it turns off. Spawning particles, and then it stops. And so that's what that activation setting is there for. I can right-click this and say delete channels to get rid of all my animation. Let's set this to 1, and now we just have a constant birth rate of 50,000. Back to our simulation here. Let's say that I want to be super mean and kill off these particles because, well, they're actually going pretty crazy right now, and I don't like that. We need to then adjust the life expectancy. And our life expectancy is how long these particles are to live. Right now we are at 100, which means that these particles are allowed to live for 100 seconds before they get killed. If we want to kill them earlier, we can say 1. And now, on frame 24, and every single second, these particles are going to pass away tragically. And now we kind of have a bit more of this controlled rune shape going on because it's not allowed to live past this zone up here, which is good. There is a problem though with this whole thing right now. And the problem is that this is all happening uniformly. You can actually kind of see, especially from a side profile, that it's all just kind of dying at the same time. And that's kind of a jarring effect right there. In other words, it's not very pleasant, I guess. And to help us with this problem, we have life variance. Life variance will basically add or subtract from the life expectancy for each particle to give it a different time when it dies off. So if I say 0.5 in my life variance, the longest a particle is now allowed to live is 1.5, 1 plus 0.5, and the earliest a life of a particle is allowed to be is 1 minus 0.5. In other words, 0.5 is the earliest. So 1 plus or minus 0.5 are like a min and max, and that whole range gets distributed randomly for each point. And that's how we have this random die-off effect, which looks a lot better. Okay, so now that we have that, let's adjust this a bit more. I'm going to change the life expectancy now to, let's say, 0.25, the life variance here to 1, and this will just kind of give us a more shimmering effect, which I like. Let's also bump up the speed that everything is moving at. So let's go to our pop force. I'm going to say an amplitude of 2 on that noise, and on the wind, I'm going to also say a velocity of 2. And by doing that, we now have this cool looking rune effect. And that's that. In the next lesson, we're going to take this further. We're going to cache this all out and start moving towards rendering this out and putting it all together.